Welcome to a special pandemic emergency edition of the How to Japanese podcast. This will be an audio version of a presentation I'm giving for the Chicago Consulate to departing jets. This is a presentation I've given before in person, and usually when we do that, I'm able to drill the students a little bit and give them the opportunity to practice Japanese phrases that they'll encounter on jet. Obviously, everything's virtual this year, so I thought it would be, rather than having them take notes or trying to drill an entire Zoom meeting of 30 to 40 departing jets, which sounds like a nightmare, better to just record it as a podcast, which gives me the opportunity to practice it as well. And then the jets can use it as a reference and practice on their own before they leave. I usually call this presentation a pre-jet Japanese triage, and that's really what it is. It's aimed at people who have zero to very little Japanese experience. So if you are going on jet and have studied even, I'd say, a year or two of Japanese, a lot of this stuff will not be quite so helpful. But I do think there are some tips that I have that are maybe more specific to the jet experience that will be helpful for you or for anyone considering going on the jet program, going to live in Japan in a teaching environment. So feel free, if none of that applies to you, to skip past this episode and wait for the next week's episode. There's a PowerPoint presentation that will go along with this episode. I'll find a way to put it up on the blog post, so definitely check the blog for that and follow along with that as you're listening. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Before I get started, I did want to explain one of my favorite Japanese words, which is gogai. That's how I'm numbering this episode. It literally means outside of the count. Go is the go from bango, and gai is soto, or outside. And it's a newspaper term that I guess one of my Japanese teachers taught me in first or second year that I thought was really cool. So gogai is the special editions of newspapers that newspapers put out when there's some kind of breaking news or something like that. And I remember seeing a news report. I don't remember if it was in the class that I learned the word in or if it was just separately watching Japanese TV somewhere. There was a news segment about these people who are obsessed with these gogai editions that are generally just 1 or 2 pages that get printed, and the newspapers would then rush it to big stations around Japan, around Tokyo, and hand it out to people. And obviously this was probably back in the 80s and 90s, probably before that even, and lasted, I don't know if it's still going, to be honest, but you'd think it's something that the internet would kill, but it was this kind of interesting curiosity that these people were obsessed with, and they would collect these special gogai editions of newspapers. And so I always labeled my blog posts gogai back when I was blogging 3 days a week, and any other posts I put up, I would label them with gogai. So one of my favorite little Japanese words. So this episode will come between the 16th and 17th episodes, but I will label it gogai because it is special edition. It is coming out between these 2 other episodes and does not count as part of the numbering system for my second season of the podcast. Thank you for briefly entertaining my Japanese language nerdism, and now on to the main content. Congratulations, you're going on the JET program. What Japanese do you need to know? What do you need to be familiar with? That's what we're going to learn today a little bit. But first, I'll give you a little bit of introduction about myself. I'm Daniel Morales. I was a CIR/ALT on the JET program from 2005 to 2008 in Fukushima Prefecture in a small town called Nishiaizu. There were about I want to say 8,000 to 9,000 people when I lived there. I think that's probably closer to 6,000 right now, as you can see from the pictures on the slides. It was a very small town. I was functionally an ALT, occasionally had a couple interpretation-related roles to do, but I was in the classroom 5 days a week. After JET, I moved to Tokyo and worked as a translation editor. For just about 2 years, I was able to work on a couple fun projects. Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker was the big one I worked on that was fun, and then a bunch of kind of silly DS games. And I did not put all the boring stuff that I worked on here, which included things like service manuals for arcade machines, different proposals for video games, and other just random business related material like the steel manufacturing document that I was editing on the very first day I worked there. While I was on Jet, I think my third year, I started blogging at How to Japanese, and I've been doing that since 2008. It connected me with the Japan Times and a bunch of other writers from the Japanese Twitter sphere, and I've been writing for the Japan Times bilingual page basically since 2010, very frequently and regularly since about 2014. So please do go back and look at a lot of those. There's a lot of really good bilingual content on the Japan Times. So I'd recommend subscribing to that and reading not just me, but lots of other really, really smart writers about learning Japanese. So to give you an idea of what I've done with myself since Jet and Japan and writing, I got more into writing, so I went back and got an MFA in New Orleans, my hometown. Then I moved up to Chicago, where I worked at the Japanese consulate as a political assistant. And in 2018, I moved on to the Institute of Real Estate Management and just recently ended there as a manager for their international programs. They had a large number of Japanese members, and I was kind of involved in helping them develop. And I just left, and I'll be enrolling at the Inter-University Center for Japanese Language Studies starting in September. So what are our goals for today? The goals are to cover a few basic phrases that are critical for daily interaction with coworkers and other Japanese people that you will encounter. I want to help you learn some school and classroom Japanese that will help you be a better jet. And I want to give you some conceptual clues that will put you in a better position to learn Japanese more easily. And hopefully I will have tips for beginner, intermediate, and advanced students. So hopefully there's something for everybody. But as I mentioned in the beginning, this will be mostly kind of oriented towards those who have very little experience with the language. But before I get into any of the actual language, I do want to start with one caveat, which is that your job is not to study Japanese. Your job is on the JET program is to teach English. Studying Japanese, it can be something that you're interested in, it can be something that you're spending your free time on, but during your 9 to 5 working hours, you're there to teach English. So this is something that was really impressed upon me by one of the teachers that I was working with. You know, after a couple of months, he said, "Daniel, you're doing a really good job in the classroom, you know, getting along with the students, but you need to be speaking more English." And that was a wake-up call for me personally. And so I like to start with that warning. So just be prepared to use English with the kids. Obviously, there will be some times when you need to use Japanese here and there, but your role really should be that of modeling good English. Some of the first Japanese words that are really important to know that will ground you in your JET experience are the words for schools. So I'll go ahead and read these out in Japanese and English. Hoikuen, hoikusho, preschool. Youchien, kindergarten. Shogakko, elementary school, primary school. Chugakko, junior high school. Koukou, high school. And you can add sei to any of these to turn that from school into student. Shogakusei, elementary school student. Chugakusei, junior high school student. Koukousei, high school student. You also need to learn how to refer to the different levels of students. So elementary school has 1st through 6th grade, and junior high school and high school have 1st through 3rd. And here's how you say these students. Ichinensei, first year, first grader. Ninensei, second year, second grader. Sannensei, third year, third grader. Yonensei, fourth grader. Gonensei, fifth grader. Rokunensei, sixth grader. You'll also have to become familiar with how the teachers refer to themselves and how students refer to the teachers. The most common way is to combine the surname of the teacher plus sensei. So, for example, Mr. Kawashima would be Kawashima Sensei, but you occasionally get the first name too. For example, one of my teachers was named Mikio, and Watanabe Mikio was his Japanese name, and he would often go by Mikio Sensei. So that really varies by the students' relations with the teachers and teachers' relations with the students, how casual they are. But that's something you can pick up when you get to your school. For the most part, I would assume, go in with the assumption that it's last name plus sensei is the basic way to refer to a teacher in general. Types of teachers, at the very top, you have the principal, Kouchou sensei. The Kouchou sensei is also closer to a headmaster role at times, depending on the school too. Kyoto sensei is the assistant principal and is often maybe closer to a principal in American schools, I found. And all the other teachers are go by their names, or they would go by the subject. Eigo no sensei would be English teacher. Rekishi no sensei, history teacher. And then the other two that are useful are Tanin no sensei, this is homeroom teacher. And the other is Jimu no sensei, the school secretary, who is often a very important person to know. It's also good to know the different subjects. Kamoku is the word for subject in Japanese, and here are the different subjects. Eigo, English. Kokugo, Japanese or language. Sugaku, math. Shakai, social studies. Rika, science. Ongaku, music. Kateika, home economics. Taiku, PE. Here are a few other words that are useful. Jugyo is the word for class. Kumi is a homeroom group. They're the group that makes up the homeroom. So this often gets referred to by the year number and then the group number. So for example, the group 2 in the third year students would be Sannen ni Kumi. And so you can imagine all the different combinations there. You'd have Ichinen Ichikumi, Ichinen Nikumi, Ichinen Sankumi, all the way up to however many groups that they have, depending on the size of the school. Bukatsu is sports or clubs and is a huge part of the students' identity. They are generally very devoted to their activities. And Hokago is the after-school period or the extracurricular period. There's a great website, maggiesensei.com, has a lot of resources, and this link in particular has some great school-related vocabulary that I would recommend studying. When you arrive on the JET program, you are going to be introducing yourself a lot to different schools, to different town staff, so it's critical to have a very short, succinct self-introduction ready to go that you are incredibly familiar with and you can roll out. And then once you've mastered it, you can kind of expand it from there, make a 15-second version, a 30-second version, a 45-second version for whatever the occasion is. But you also need that 5-second self-introduction, and I'm going to teach it to you. So first you say hajimemashite. It literally means this is a beginning. This is used for the first time you're meeting someone. Hajimemashite. Then you say the Japanese version of your surname or your name, and you add des to the end. So I'm Daniel, so I would be Danieru desu. Or Morales is my last name, Moraresu desu. That's literally I am Daniel or I am Morales. And then you finish it with yoroshiku onegai shimasu, which literally means please be kind to me, please treat me well. It gets used in a lot of different situations, like when you're making requests. So it's roughly equivalent to a please, and you're kind of trying to ingratiate yourself with the person that you're meeting for the first time. So altogether, you say, Hajimemashite, Danieru desu, yoroshiku onegai shimasu. And that's something that you should practice and be able to roll out whenever you need it. There are other more polite ways to introduce yourself, such as tomoshimasu and things like that. But I would really recommend perfecting this one before you move on, because it is, I would say, perfectly polite for most situations that you will encounter as a JET. I like to take a little time to introduce the word E during this presentation because you will see it so often and it is so multifaceted that it is really important to have some kind of understanding of what it means and how it gets used. E is often translated as good. It does mean good, but it also means nice, fine, or sufficient. So as you can see, a pretty broad spectrum. The actual meaning is really dependent on the context and the tone of how it's used. For example, the most basic phrase that you'll hear it in is "ii desu ne," which means that's nice or cool. You can also use it to ask for permission. "Ii desu ka?" May I, or is this okay? Okay is another really good definition for E. And then, as you can see, it also means no thank you. "Ii desu." That's a very clear way to say that's enough. And because E is so useful for asking permission, I did want to give you some examples of how to make your E more polite. So just you could even ask it. E is a way to say, is this okay? You can also say ino, which I would say is probably the same level of politeness as just E. But when you add des and ka to the end, des is, we learned earlier, it's a way to say it is or I am, and ka marks a question. It suddenly becomes a lot more polite. So, ii desu ka? And then you can make your E even more polite by swapping it in the word yoroshi, which is a more polite version of E. So, yoroshi desu ka? Or the even more polite, yoroshi deshou ka? The example that always gets used for this phrase is obviously picking a chair to sit in. If you're sitting next to somebody, you can ask ii desu ka? But you can use it for almost anything, eating the food somewhere, walking somewhere. There's a lot of different ways to combine these with other phrases to ask for permission. Speaking of asking for things, when you arrive on jet, you will likely need a good bit of support, finding out how your town or city or prefecture works, how the schools work, and you'll be relying on the town staff, city staff, the school staff, even the students. And so when you make these requests, the language you use will make a huge difference on the result that you get. So I always recommend first prioritizing your requests, asking yourself, is this essential or is this a luxury? And then also deploying what one of my Japanese teachers called an airbag phrase, which is a linguistic expression that you can use to lighten the request and also warn the listener that you're about to make a request. So what are these airbag phrases? You're already familiar with a lot of them. The most basic one is sumimasen ga. It's just a very simple excuse me, but it goes a long way in kind of setting someone up, even getting their attention. Another great phrase is gomewaku de nakereba, if it isn't too much trouble. And then also one that I really like is kyoshuku desu ga. It's terrible of me / selfish of me, but these are all airbag phrases that kind of humble yourself before making a request. I like to also introduce this last phrase because I think it's a great example of how in Japanese you're often narrating what you're doing as a part of polite speech. So for example, this is a phrase you'd use if you need to ask a question. Chotto kikitai desu ga? I'd like to ask a question, but phrases like this might seem a little obvious, but I think when you're using a second language, sometimes you need to force yourself to say them because you're so focused instead on the content of your actual question. This is especially useful on the phone if you call a restaurant and want to ask what time they open or close. Before just saying, Nanji ni akimasu ka? Nanji ni shimarimasu ka? Just instead of bombarding them with the question, start by just saying, hey, I'd like to ask a question. Chotto kikitai desu ka? That way, the person you're talking to has then received this information, is now expecting a question, and has turned their brain into, okay, let me gather this question and then go search for a response mode. So when you put them all together, it sounds something like this. Kyoshuku desu ga, moshi gomeiwaku de nakereba, yubin kyoku ni tsurete itte itadakemasen deshou ka? And this is a question that you might be asking at the very beginning of your stay. If you need a ride somewhere, could you take me to the post office, which is often where you'll be doing your banking. You shouldn't feel required to use every element of this request, but hopefully some of this language is something that you can use going forward, little pieces of it to piece together the kind of requests that you need to be making. Another critical skill to develop is the ability to say no politely in Japanese. I think in Japan, often you'll be saying yes to most questions. Would you like some of our delicious sushi? Yes, please. Would you like this lightly battered and deliciously fried tonkatsu? Yes, please. Would you like to go on an 8-hour hike that may be beyond your abilities athletically? Maybe yes for some of you, but maybe no for others of you. So I think knowing how to respond in situations like that is critical. As I mentioned earlier, the word E is critical here. It means sufficient, enough. So no thank you. Ii desu when you do not want something, when you've had enough of something. You can also make this more polite and maybe even a little bit more clear by saying kekkou desu, kekkou desu. But in other situations, you need to make it even more clear that you will not be participating. This phrase, inryo shimasu, not an easy one to pronounce, inryo shimasu. It literally means I will restrain myself. You can think of it as saying, I'll pass, thank you very much. It really is, I think, one of the most powerful Japanese phrases, and you can use it when you do not want to do something, if you'd rather sit something out. And I often think of it as that phrase from Pirates of the Caribbean where they say, I am disinclined to acquiesce to your request. What does it mean? It means no. You don't want to use inryo shimasu ironically or sarcastically. I would say I would refrain from doing that, but I would say saving it for those occasions when you honestly need to skip something. It can be incredibly useful to have in your linguistic holster. I do want to say a little something about keigo, which is polite speech. If you've studied the language at all, I'm sure this is something that you've encountered and you've probably even heard of, even if you haven't studied the language that much. But basically, it's different language that you can use to show respect for others and humble yourself. The good news is that you're probably already doing it. Desmas is keigo. Desmas is two different forms. So if you imagine me holding an apple in my hand, I would say ringo desu for the polite version and ringo da for the regular version, and they both mean it's an apple. I just use them in different contexts. Or you would say tabemasu, which means to eat in the polite form, or taberu, which means to eat in the regular form. I'd recommend kind of training yourself to stick to desmasu, especially if you're just starting with the language, because by default it's going to be more polite. I'd also recommend really studying these two patterns that you're going to start to hear relatively often. Onegai shimasu and o azukari shimasu. These are two very basic keigo patterns that you'll hear. And the first, onegai shimasu, is a way to say please. O azukari shimasu you'll encounter at the convenience stores when you hand somebody a 1,000 yen bill. They will say, "O azukari shimasu," I will humbly accept this bill and then take it to pay for your goods. Because there are several different forms of keigo, it can be very intimidating, but I like to recommend two ways for beginners to start to access keigo. First is to think about, am I describing my actions or someone else's actions? And when you're describing someone else's actions, you need to use the respectful, polite form. And one way to do that is to use the passive form of a verb. So in this example, natsuyasumi ni doko ka ikaremasu ka? Are you going to go somewhere during summer vacation? I'm using the passive form of the verb iku, which means to go, ikaremasu, ikaremasu. And that's a polite way to ask someone else about their actions doing something. This would be a really useful phrase, for example, at a party. Often you're pouring beer for someone else at a party. If you go up to the kocho sensei, the principal, you could say, "Kocho sensei, biru nomaremasu ka?" Mr. Principal, would you like to have some beer? It's a polite way to ask if you can pour for them. So that's a good way to start putting this keigo into practice. When you're describing other people's actions, you can think, okay, I can use the passive form of a verb safely to politely describe what they're doing and ask them a question. When you're describing your own actions, on the other hand, you use the polite o, the stem of the verb, and shimasu. So this is like the two verbs we saw on the last slide. Onegai shimasu, I humbly make this request. O azukari shimasu, I humbly take control of your 1,000 yen bill. This is also a way we can level up the politeness of our phrase from earlier. Previously it was kikitai desu ka? But we can make that humble keigo by saying okiki shitai desu ga? So listen one more time. Kikitai desu ka? Okiki shitai desu ga? So again, there's a lot of different keigo, a lot of different ways to use it. My recommendations are always to really give yourself a strong foundation with desmasu forms and to find a way into the other keigo phrases by starting with passive keigo to talk about other people's actions and to start with humble keigo to describe your own actions. Next, I'd like to talk about dialects. You'll be going to all over Japan, and there's dozens and dozens of local regional dialects, especially if you're in the countryside. Too many to look really closely at any of them. But just to give you an example, Kansai Ben is used around Osaka and Kyoto. It takes words like wakaranai, which means I don't understand, and makes it wakarahen. And so this hen gets used for nai. You also see things like akan, which means dameda or hell no. Kansai Ben gets used by a lot of the comedians. I would say resist using Kansai Ben because it is so strongly associated with comedians, and you don't want to look too much like a clown, I would say. Tohoku Ben is the area where I was. Tohoku is the northeastern area, and you see some of these local variations like desho becomes dabe or ibe. And they have words like sasukene, which means daijobu or no worries, mate, something like that. I think dialects in Japan tend to use new words or different words, whereas in English we just kind of pronounce words very differently based on where we are in the country. My advice is always really to focus on hyojungo, the standard Japanese that's spoken by newscasters. You'll always be understood basically no matter where you go if you're speaking desmas hyojungo. You feel free to pick up a little flavor here and there, but again, don't turn into a clown. One phrase that I used pretty regularly was oban de gozaimasu. Whenever I had to MC an event, often they were in the evening, and this was a way to say good evening in the kind of local dialect. But I would say that was really the only phrase I learned to use regularly, to be honest. It was more fulfilling to be able to understand the dialect, to be honest, and that just took time. When I first arrived, I couldn't really understand my host father, and by the end of 3 years, I had no problem having a conversation with him. I was using Hyojungo, and he would kind of go into dialect here and there, but we were able to have a beer together. We're getting close to the end of the presentation, and I wanted to introduce a few set phrases. Japanese set phrases can feel very culturally specific and different at first, but memorizing them will give you real ultimate Japanese power, I think. And I think the really key part is memorizing them and getting used to them rather than focusing on learning them. Getting used to them means learning them in context and then becoming able to deploy them yourself. The first is otsukare-sama desu. A kind of basic translation is thank you for your efforts. The context is you can imagine someone is leaving work ahead of you. If somebody's leaving the office, you can say otsukare-sama desu to them as a kind of nice greeting as they're leaving. You say it really often, to be honest, whenever you complete something, whenever you leave work. Sometimes it can even be the very first thing you say to somebody during the day. I remember getting on the elevator with somebody here at the consulate, and I think they had just gotten back from a trip or something, and the very first thing I said to them that day was, otsukare-sama desu. Another very useful one is osaki ni shitsurei shimasu. Osaki ni shitsurei shimasu. It means excuse me for going first or leaving early. Often jets will have different working hours from other teachers, and if you need to leave the office early, you can say this as a kind of recognition that, okay, I'm leaving early. It's a little bit rude of me. Shitsurei shimasu. And another one is one that we learned also at the very beginning. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Onegai shimasu. These are so useful. You should really think of it as please. Whenever you would use please, and I hope you're using please often, you can use onegai shimasu, basically. So, for example, if somebody says, "Issho ni ikimasu ka?" Shall we go together? Or something like that at the beginning of your stay, if they volunteer to show you somewhere. If you want to say, yes, I want to accept your offer, you can say, "Hai, onegai shimasu." And if we wanted to decline an offer, we also know how to do that. We know how to say, "ii desu," right? No, I do not need this. I'm fine. Thank you. So as I was preparing for this presentation, I was updating my old version, which I gave a few years ago, and I wanted to do a little bit more research. And so I Googled and I found an article, or actually it was a forum discussion, asking Japanese the question, what do you want foreigners to know about the Japanese language? What do you want them to be learning? And I came away with 3 ideas from reading all the different posts. The first is learn standard Japanese. Don't imitate young people. They don't speak Japanese. Obviously, I don't fully agree with this statement. Obviously, I believe that language evolves, but I do think it's good to learn standard Japanese, clean desmasu, hyojungo to start with. Build a strong foundation and then branch out from there. The second idea was discussing the frequently encountered Nihongo jozu or ohashi jozu, which, if you haven't heard it before, means, oh, your Japanese is great, or you use chopsticks very well. I think a lot of foreigners have started to bristle at some of these compliments, but the Japanese in the forum made really interesting points, I thought, which was that often people use these phrases just to kind of start a conversation. They're not actually trying to praise you, but it feels like one of the easiest ways into a conversation. So be careful about what kind of assumptions you're making, but obviously look out for yourself too. And then finally, the forum noted that Japanese, like many languages, is contextual, and you need to adjust what language you're using based on who is in the conversation. So that points to some of the ideas about learning keigo, sticking to desmasu, some of those ideas. I think these are really interesting points to keep in mind as you're studying the language. And I want to end on a couple of general ideas, realizations that I think were helpful for me along the way. The first is that Japanese is an easy language. Becoming literate in Japanese, I would say, is hard. So if you're looking to read Japanese, that's going to take, I would say, a couple years to do, but you can become quite proficient in the language relatively quickly, given the right study strategies and the right commitment, I would say. Just don't let yourself think it's harder than it is, which I think can be self-defeating at times. And the other realization that was really important for me along the way is that when you are studying a language, you are constantly putting yourself in a position of weakness. And you need to really be mindful about what effect that has on you mentally. Don't let it drag you down too far. Making a small mistake, language mistake, isn't a huge deal. You need to be comfortable being corrected. You need to be comfortable making mistakes in front of other people and getting back up and trying again. And I'll end with the very simple, one does not simply learn Japanese, one gets used to Japanese. I really do believe this. You are just constantly getting used to it, and there's no better place to do that than in Japan. So congratulations again for making it through this long, long wait and finally getting over to Japan during a crazy, crazy year. I hope you all have an amazing time. Please stay safe and get in touch. Let me know if you have any questions about the language, about JET, about post-JET careers. I'm glad to help any way I can. You can reach me at howtojapanese@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. You can find How to Japanese on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Substack. And we'll see you next week. それではまた来週.